As the war drags on in Southeast Asia and Vietnam, the push and pull between the Soviet Union and the United States for influence continues around the globe. The United States is caught up in its own time of turbulence when various groups are petitioning the government to make their voices heard, to live in peace and freedom as their counterparts in the United States do. And there is a time of progressivism or liberalism from the Supreme Court, which hands down several rulings intended to protect the rights and privacy of marginalized groups. The year of 1968 brought turmoil to the United States. The Orangeburg Massacre at South Carolina State University, violence at Columbia University following student protests, and the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, and the beatings of demonstrators outside of the Democratic National Convention by Chicago police officers illustrated a mounting sense of frustration with both the status quo and the activities of protesters. The sense of dissatisfaction was not confined to U.S. borders, as predominantly young protesters in Paris, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Yugoslavia, Germany, Italy, Spain, Japan, and Mexico City demonstrated against oppressive governments and inadequate educational systems. Richard Nixon ran for president against Herbert Humphrey, who was Lyndon Johnson's vice president, and segregationist Governor George Wallace from Alabama. Nixon sought to create a broad coalition of supporters ranging from traditional Republicans to Democrats who were frustrated with the continuing protests in the United States. Part of Nixon's campaign strategy was to highlight law and order, which was a subtle way of saying that he would stamp out Black militancy. He also appealed to the racial biases by promising to rein in civil rights enforcement and stop busing to force school integration. Nixon's appeal to moderate and conservative whites, along with his promise to end the war in Vietnam, propelled him to victory, though none of the candidates won a majority of the vote. Nixon's election signaled a shift in power from the new left to the new right American political culture and began 2 decades of conservative leadership in the United States. Now, here we can see the map of the election from 1968, and we see that Nixon wins 43.4% of the popular vote. Herbert Humphrey, 42.7% of the popular vote, and George Wallace actually coming in at almost 14% of the popular vote. Wallace was popular in Louisiana, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, and does actually manage to gain one elector here in North Carolina. And so that really indicates that Wallace's views on segregation were widely held in some of these southern states. Nixon, again, really enjoys a large majority of the country, and as a Republican, taking states that have historically been open to immigrants, allowing women to vote, and things of that nature. Humphrey, a Democrat, managing to keep Texas, but a lot of those northeastern states as well. Now, Nixon does enjoy the electoral vote, which is significant, of course, in a presidential election. Now, this is one of the few times in our nation's history when a third-party candidate did achieve significant popular vote. George Wallace running as an independent. Now, Nixon promised to end the war in Vietnam, and the process of doing so proved to be very challenging. Nixon inaugurated a strategy known as Vietnamization, in which American troops would gradually turn over responsibility for fighting the war to the South Vietnamese. Although Nixon was attempting to reduce the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam, the American military continued to act aggressively in other ways, as Nixon ordered secret bombing operations in Cambodia in an attempt to rid the nation of Viet Cong-supported networks. If you review the map from the previous chapter, you can see the routes that the Viet Cong would take from North Vietnam through Cambodia down into South Vietnam. Nixon had U.S. forces invade Cambodia in 1970 after the bombing campaign failed, but the U.S. military presence destabilized the nation and propelled the violent and oppressive Khmer Rouge into power. The United States also invaded Laos with little success. Now, it's important to understand this Khmer Rouge, which was really a communist organization, communist-supported organization in which a really nasty guy named Pol Pot spent several years eradicating the nation of anyone that was considered to be intellectual or middle class or anyone who really was not a peasant. And this goes on for a long time. And although some historians do not refer to this as a genocide because it is Cambodians killing other Cambodians, many other historians call it a genocide because a large number of people who are not considered impoverished are targeted. People who wore glasses might be exterminated. Those who had an advanced education or any formal education, as well as those who could read. In December of 1962, Nixon ordered an 11-day bombing campaign that pushed the North Vietnamese government to seek an opportunity for peace. An accord was signed on January 27, 1963, giving the United States a sense of achieving peace without honor. By 1975, however, the North Vietnamese had captured the southern part of the country and implemented communist rule. By the end of the conflict, the United States had lost more than 58,000 soldiers. The South Vietnamese forces had suffered more than 215,000 casualties, and the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong had lost 1 million soldiers. Roughly 4 million North and South Vietnamese had lost their lives. The anti-war movement continued at home and picked up momentum when Nixon made it more difficult for American men to avoid the draft. The invasion in Cambodia also spurred a widespread student demonstration period, the most famous of which was a protest at Kent State University where 4 students were killed by the National Guard. In 1971, the New York Times and the Washington Post printed a classified report known as the Pentagon Papers, which stated that Kennedy and Johnson's administrations had lied to the public about the purpose of Vietnam. The publication of the report led to the 1973 passage of the War Powers Act, which required that the President consult Congress about various aspects of war conduct. Though Nixon was a firm anti-communist, he also recognized that a balance of power in the world would have benefits for the United States and sought to ease tensions with Cold War enemies. Nixon secretly planned a trip to China and was the first president since the Cold War began to do so. His trip opened diplomatic relations between the new nations by promising trade opportunities and diplomacy. Nixon also visited the Soviet Union in 1972 to discuss an arms control with the Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev, thus resulting in the SALT I agreement, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which limited the number of anti-ballistic missiles and intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-based missiles. On October 6, 1973, Egyptian and Syrian forces reoccupied a territory that the Israelis had occupied since 1967. The United States and the Soviet Union led the way to a ceasefire that returned the territory to Israel. The conflict led the Arab-dominated OPEC to launch an oil embargo on the United States, resulting in a gas shortage and a spike in unemployment. Nixon's domestic policies and shrinking size of the American government by moving away from the Great Society programs and by putting financial resources directly in the hands of the people of the states. Nixon's policies were not entirely in lockstep with conservative thinking, however. In 1970, Nixon promoted the passage of the Environmental Protection Act. He also established the Occupational Safety and Health Administration in 1972, and he oversaw the creation of the Consumer Product Safety Commission and signed off on legislation that made advertising of cigarettes on the television and the radio illegal. Now, Nixon campaigned on decreasing the size of the American government, and he really worked to do this by giving more power to individual states. But at the same time, Nixon implemented and supported government policies and programs that would have been considered very progressive or liberal programs of the day. With regard to racial issues, Nixon opposed busing and believed that communities in upheaval would benefit from less government intervention. In part, this position was designed to pacify the white conservatives and stave off the challenge of George Wallace in 1972. Now, what's taking place with this busing is a Supreme Court case that was handed down called Swan v. Mecklenburg, in which the Supreme Court ruled that in order to ensure that schools were adequately integrated, that students may need to be bused out of their neighborhoods into other schools. Even today, we typically see that a person's school is assigned by the neighborhood in which they live. And this means that we will have, especially in urban areas, schools that are largely of a particular racial demographic, especially in the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s, when we see the legacy of that residential segregation that we've talked about. So Nixon opposes this, and he opposes this because those white middle-class families in the North do not like the idea of their children being bused into Black neighborhoods and into formerly Black schools. Nixon embraced policies that advanced the cause of African Americans, including the expansion of affirmative action programs, the encouragement of Black capitalism, and the 1970 extension of the Voting Rights Act. So Nixon was a relatively progressive president and a relatively supportive president for issues that impacted African Americans. In addition to a mix of conservative and liberal policies on race and other issues, Nixon worked to halt inflation, to implement wage and price controls. All of this helped to improve the economy in time for Nixon to win the 1972 presidential election. Nixon easily won this election, which referred to the strong and polarizing campaign of Vice Presidents Spiro Agnew and George Wallace, which failed the bid for the Democratic nomination. This also ended in an assassination attempt. George McGovern's own lackluster campaign all fed into the victory for President Nixon. Nixon won more than 60% of the popular vote. Recall from the previous election, he only managed to win about 42% of the popular vote. So Nixon was popular in terms of the American public. Democrats did maintain the majority in the Congress. In spite of the victory, Nixon's campaign conduct would be the ending of his success. In 1972, on June 17th, 5 men broke into the Democratic National Party headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. As the investigation unfolded, it was revealed that the Committee for the Re-election of the President, called the CREEP, was responsible for the break-in. Nixon may or may not have known about the break-in before it happened, and there isn't really evidence to indicate that he knew ahead of time or ordered the break-in. However, Nixon immediately engaged in a cover-up, ordering his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, to quelch a thorough investigation of the scandal in the name of national security. Nixon promised to pay off the burglars and suggested that he would pardon them after their conviction. As the Watergate scandal unfolded, it became clear that the Nixon administration had engaged in illegal activities prior to the 1972 campaign. In 1971, when a secret group of operatives known as the Plumbers, among whom were some of the Watergate burglars, were formed. Now, the Watergate Plumbers were supposed to prevent leaks about the government from landing in the media. One of the group's activities involved breaking into the office of Daniel Ellsberg, a psychiatrist, in an attempt to discredit Ellsberg, who had leaked those Pentagon papers. Nixon secretly wiretapped members of his administration and members of the media. Key to unraveling the Watergate scandal and the Nixon administration's misdeeds were Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward of the Washington Post, who relied on the FBI official Mark Felt, then known only as Deep Throat, to provide information linking the president to the Plumbers. As the scandal came to light, the Senate conducted televised hearings, which revealed that Nixon had tapped his Oval Office conversations. The Supreme Court ordered him to turn over those tapes to a special prosecutor. Some of Nixon's top officials and advisors, including Attorney General John Mitchell, H.R. Haldeman, and John Elkelman, resigned. 25 members of Nixon's administration eventually went to jail. As it grew increasingly clear that the Nixon administration had participated in unsavory and illegal political activities, the threat of impeachment was looming, and Nixon resigned on August 9, 1974, ending his political career in disgrace. Now, it's important to keep in mind that Nixon was not the first president to engage in misconduct, and he was certainly not the last president to engage in misconduct on the campaign trail and while in office. However, Nixon is really the ground zero of public televised investigations into misconduct. Nixon was succeeded by Gerald Ford, whom Nixon had chosen to replace Spiro Agnew as vice president after Agnew's own political career had disintegrated into scandal. Now, Ford chose New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller as his vice president. Ford's most memorable moment as president came shortly after he took office, when he pardoned Nixon for his war crimes. In spite of a less than noteworthy first term, Gerald Ford won the Republican presidential nomination in 1967, but he was narrowly defeated in election by Jimmy Carter, the former Georgia governor and Washington outsider. What we see is a push on the part of Americans to move away from candidates and presidents who are considered the Washington insiders and part of that political belt. And they want someone who doesn't fit or conform to traditional Washington politics. Economic turmoil marked Carter's tenure. The OPEC nations controlled 80% of the world's oil supply. They increased the oil prices to such a degree that gas prices more than quadrupled over the course of the 1970s. High oil prices prompted American manufacturers to move their factories to Latin America and Asia, resulting in a decline in union membership and a migration from the industrial regions to the Sun Belt. In addition to the steep upturn in gas prices, the late 1970s saw home prices double, car prices increase, and consumer debt rise. Inflation and stagnant wages, as well as rising unemployment, led to a situation that economists labeled as stagflation. American confidence in the government was low, and Carter's policies had little momentum. He drew ridicule for his 1977 energy plan, which he called the moral equivalent of war. His critics called it meow. The same year, Carter created the Department of Energy. In 1977, Carter created the National Energy Act, which established gas emission standards for automobiles and offered incentives for installing alternate energy systems. Carter did support some conservative principles as well. During his time in office, Carter rejected proposals for national health insurance and expensive employment programs. He also appealed to conservative proponents by he also appealed to conservative proponents of free market economics by backing laws that deregulated the airline, banking, trucking, and railroad industries. So we do see efforts on the part of Carter, much like Nixon, to work with the opposition party and those that have different views on how to best manage the economy. Looking at this map, what we see is two specific things that I want to point out. The first is what here is known as the Rust Belt. And so these are areas where we see things like auto manufacturing and mills. And we see a shift, we see a migration in this. And then the other thing that we see here is that Sun Belt, which we've talked about. And so these areas are important when we think about industry in the 1970s. Now, I want to remind you that the term counterculture, we tend to think of counter as a bad word or rebel as a bad word. And counterculture just really means that this is the culture that is in opposition to the dominant culture. And rebels really means that they are rebelling against whatever system of government is in place at the time. Although conservatism was on the rise, the liberalism of the 1960s lingered and continued to influence mainstream culture. Long hair, colorful clothes, rock music, drug use, and sexual experimentation were normalized. By the end of the 1970s, sexual experimentation had resulted in the nation's divorce rate reaching an all-time high. Social movements influenced popular culture as well, with rock continuing to evolve and artists like Bruce Springsteen, Billy Joel, Jackson Browne capturing the attention of wide audiences. Films like MASH offered a critique of the Vietnam War, although MASH itself was actually set in the Korean War. Television shows like All in the Family offered American audiences a depiction of strife between liberals and conservatives, symbolized by Archie Bunker's commentary about feminists, liberals, religious, racial, and ethnic minorities, and those who protested against the Vietnam War. The women's movement achieved great victory with the Supreme Court's 1973 Roe v. Wade ruling, which decriminalized abortion. The decision triggered profound political conflict between pro-life and pro-choice forces. The National Organization for Women, or NOW, succeeded in winning the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment in 35 out of the necessary 38 states. But the organization came into conflict with conservative women over the amendment, which prohibited the discrimination on the basis of sex. Now, you might ask yourself, why would women oppose this amendment? But what you want to keep in mind is that for many women, there were protections, at least in their mind, that were in place with keeping this amendment from being put in place. One is that an equal rights amendment would require that women register for the draft. Although it would require that women be paid equally, it would remove protections for women who were not required to work in certain industries. Phyllis Schlafly led conservative women in their efforts, establishing the Stop ERA organization and arguing that the amendment would diminish women's rights to abide by normative gender roles, live as housewives, use single-sex bathrooms, and avoid military service. Schlafly's campaign was successful, and in 1982, the ERA died. In 1972, Congress passed the Educational Amendment Act, which included Title IX, a provision preventing universities and colleges from discriminating against women, particularly in the fields of athletics. The women's movement saw other victories in the 1970s, including the establishment of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which offered women a chance to fight employment discrimination. It also provided an increased presence in shelters and support organizations for victims of domestic and sexual violence, as well as the establishment of the National Women's Political Caucus in 1971. The number of women in Congress increased in this context, as Shirley Chisholm, Geraldine Ferraro, Barbara Jordan, and Patricia Schroeder all won seats. Women's political organizations gained momentum during this period. Feminism itself expanded in this period as women of color sought to link racial and sexual discrimination. In 1974, Barbara Smith led a group of feminists forming the Combahee River Collective, which articulated the ways in which racial and sexual oppression coexisted in Black women's lives. In 1970, we see a rise in environmentalism among activists were Rachel Carlson's Silent Spring, which detailed the effects of pesticides like DDT on animals, plants, humans, and water. With enthusiasm for environmental change spreading across the country, Nixon had established the Environmental Protection Agency in 1971 and signed the Clean Air Act in 1973. Congress later banned the sale of DDT. For some, environmentalism placed an overly harsh restrictions and regulations on the auto industry and made it difficult for American companies to compete with foreign car companies. In 1973, the Endangered Species Act fueled the conflict between environmentalists and timber companies in the Northwest. In 1978, housewives near Love Canal in upstate New York complained about widespread birth defects and frequent illnesses in their community. This led to investigations that revealed toxic waste sites below their housing development. In 1980, Congress passed the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or Superfund. Subsequent investigations revealed that sites requiring federal intervention were most frequently found near African American and other minority communities. In March of 1979, the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, almost experienced a meltdown, but workers diffused the situation, and the area was evacuated before the crisis set in. This incident called attention to the potential dangers of nuclear power and encouraged organizations like the Clamshell Alliance to push for the shutdown of nuclear power facilities, as well as an end to the building of nuclear power facilities. Though significant civil rights advancement occurred in the 1960s, civil rights and racial justice activism continued, building on the groundwork for political advancement laid by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. By the early 1990s, there were more than 7,500 Black elected officials in the United States, with the majority of them serving at the local level. The Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 mandated the desegregation of schools, but the process was still going slowly 15 years later. In 1969, the Supreme Court ruled that schools could no longer delay integration. And in 1971, in the Swan v. Charlotte-Mecklenburg School Board, the decision required school districts bus students to achieve integration. The Swan decision generated controversy in the North, where neighborhood and residential segregation had resulted in the segregation of the school districts, despite the absence of Jim Crow laws. In 1974, the Supreme Court ruled that students could not be bused across school district boundaries. Boston, Massachusetts erupted in conflict when predominantly white working-class South Boston and the predominantly black Roxbury were paired for busing, sparking violence in and around schools and protests outside of the federal building in downtown Boston. In addition to school integration through busing, affirmative action was an important issue of the 1970s and saw success in doubling the number of African Americans in college and narrowing the gap of income between African Americans and whites. Still, about one-third of African Americans experienced increasing poverty over the 1970s. Whites resisted affirmative action, calling it reverse discrimination and suggesting that whites suffered as a result of these policies, even though income inequality told a different story. The debate over affirmative action programs continued for 30 years, as its opponents succeeded in gradually chipping away at these policies. The 1970s saw the growth of a right-wing revival that was fueled by high taxes, frustration with the government, liberal defectors, and a growth in Christian conservatism. In addition, the white middle class expressed disapproval of Black Power, hippies, the anti-war movement, which they likened to be an anti-American movement, and feminism. Taxes were an important rallying point for the new right, as many Americans were frustrated with the level of state and federal taxes that they paid. In 1978, California voters approved Proposition 13, which reduced property tax and created hurdles for municipalities looking to increase them. Supply-side economists advocated for lowering taxes, arguing that an increase in available money would lead to an increase in hiring, and therefore the number of Americans who actually paid taxes. They supported cuts in government spending, particularly on social programs. Neoconservatives such as Irving Kristol, Norman Podhoretz, and Nathan Glazer shifted away from liberal policies that they had once supported in favor of fighting affirmative action, the New Left, and the growing anti-war movement. A significant portion of the New Right was made up of socially conservative Christians and Catholics, including Phyllis Schlafly, who was the head of the Stop the ERA campaign, as well as evangelicals who believed that they had been born again. The New Right saw a significant triumph when Ronald Reagan won the presidency in 1980. Reagan was a former Hollywood actor and California governor and a social and economic conservative. Reagan embraced tax cuts, spending reductions, and easing the federal rights regulations, as well as an end to affirmative action, the remaining Great Society programs of the Johnson era, and supported Christian conservative programs. Economic reform was Reagan's first focus, and he advocated for Reaganomics, a strategy inspired by the supply-side theorists that called for the reduction of government spending, huge tax cuts, and a lowering of lending rates. Reagan was inspired by British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, both of whom embraced conservative economic policies such as cutting government spending and lowering taxes. Reagan's popularity soared after he was shot by a would-be assassin in 1981. He was able to push Congress to pass economic reforms. At first, the measures led to a spike in unemployment, but inflation eventually fell and unemployment rose, followed by a GNP growth. Reagan cut spending on key social welfare programs, including food stamps, school lunches, aid to families with dependent children, and Medicaid, while increasing the spending on military efforts and providing tax incentives to corporations that worked with the military. At the same time, the Reagan administration eased restrictions on forming trusts, leading to corporate mergers at a pace not seen in generations. By the end of the decade, the top 1% of the families controlled 42% of the nation's wealth. The growing concentration of wealth created a culture fascinated with money, greed, luxury, and melodrama, which was reflected in television shows like Dallas and Dynasty, and films like Wall Street, which was produced in 1987. Alongside the skyrocketing wealth came a growing gap between the rich and the poor, with poverty affecting 33 million Americans, rates of homelessness rising, and the middle class shrinking. The Reagan administration signaled the change for agencies concerned with the environmental protection, consumer protection, and occupational safety, as many of their key functions shifted from federal control to state control. Labor organizations took a blow as well in 1981 when the air traffic controllers went on strike for better wages. Reagan responded by firing the strike workers and hiring new controllers. In 1984, Reagan easily defeated his Democratic challenger, former Vice President Walter Mondale, who made a noteworthy contribution to American politics by selecting Geraldine Ferraro as his running mate, who was the first woman to run for a national office on a major party ticket. Reagan's second term emphasized foreign policy, and the president increased defense spending as the Cold War continued. Now, it is important to keep in mind that even though the war in Vietnam has ended, the Cold War has continued. So this push and pull between the Soviet Union and the United States for influence around the world is continuing. Reagan's economic policies contributed to the growing deficit, which was $2.8 trillion by 1989. His conservatism shaped the Supreme Court with the appointment of Sandra Day O'Connor in 1981 and the elevation of William Rehnquist to Chief Justice in 1987. Excuse me, 1986. It is important to note that the first female Supreme Court justice was appointed by Ronald Reagan. Now, here we can see the map of the 1980 presidential election. And so Reagan is enjoying a lot of popularity across the country, from southern states, from northern states, from urban areas, from rural areas, from the Midwest. Reagan and Reagan's policies were incredibly popular across the nation. The New Right had a strong foothold during the Reagan years, and the president promoted its agenda by pushing for the removal of evolution and sex education from schoolrooms. promoting opposition to abortion and fighting homosexuality. Gays and lesbians, inspired by the gay liberation movement that had expanded over the 1970s, fought for their rights but faced retribution. In addition, in the early 1980s, doctors identified a disease called acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS, that first primarily affected gay men. Because the initial cases were isolated within the gay community, new right conservatives argued that the disease was a punishment for homosexuality. By the early 1990s, the disease had spread well beyond the gay community, and the medical community had begun to make significant progress in extending the lives of AIDS patients. Immigration was on the rise in the 1970s and 1980s, with the bulk of new arrivals coming from Latin America, the Caribbean, and Eastern Asia. The new wave of immigration drew hostility from the new right, who expressed concerns that immigrants were taking jobs and failing to embrace the mainstream American culture. Reagan facilitated legislation that allowed undocumented immigrants to stay in the United States while they worked to become legal, but punished employers who hired illegal immigrants. The measure was designed to appeal to Latino voters in the Southwest while appeasing the anti-immigration advocates. Now, it's important to note here that this policy is very similar to policies that other presidents will extend and modify. This idea of promoting an overemphasis on legal immigration while attempting to undermine and not punish overt illegal immigration. Now, here we're looking at immigrant arrivals in the United States, and we see a big spike in about 1988, and we see that continue until about 1992. In 1988, George H.W. Bush, Reagan's vice president, won the presidency over Democratic challenger Michael Dukakis by embracing conservative principles such as low taxes, opposition to abortion, gun rights, and the death penalty. Bush inherited a growing deficit, which culminated in a recession in 1990, with unemployment reaching about 7%. States were now forced to make cuts to social, health, and educational programs, which were now their responsibility rather than the responsibility of the federal government. Bush reneged on a campaign promise and raised taxes to reduce the deficit. He also frustrated his fellow conservatives by signing the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. Now, Bush campaigns, no new taxes, read my lips, no new taxes, and ultimately he has to renege on those taxes. Though Bush did sign the Clean Air Act in 1990, he continued to support the oil industry after Exxon Valdez had a tanker spill in the Prince William Sound in Alaska. He also opposed limitations on greenhouse gases. Bush contributed to the conservative transformation of the Supreme Court with the appointment of Clarence Thomas in 1991. Thomas was an African American who filled the vacancy that was left by Thurgood Marshall, who had been the first Black Supreme Court justice. Bush's popularity ratings were low by the end of the term, and he faced a significant challenge from Arkansas Governor William Jefferson Clinton. Clinton positioned himself as a centrist, supporting raising taxes on the wealthy and the death penalty, supporting welfare reform and a strong criminal justice system. Also running for president in 1992 was Texas businessman Ross Perot, who won 19% of the popular vote. As an independent candidate, this contributed to Clinton's very easy victory.